My name is David Petrasik. I'm the Interim Director of the Center for International Policy Studies. Thank you for coming. We're very pleased today to have Miko Peled here. He's come from San Diego. He's an Israeli peace activist. He's recently, last year, published a book called The General's Son, and he's been touring widely. I was looking at your website, so you seem to have been very busy, touring widely in North America, Europe, but also in the Middle East, talking about the book. Miko is the son of a famous Israeli general, and the book describes his journey, as you put it, from a family committed to the state of Israel, and I suppose to Zionist ideals, and now coming still with a commitment, but perhaps approaching it from a different perspective. So he's going to discuss his book and the work he's involved in, the activist work he's involved in Israel and Palestine and elsewhere. We also have today Professor Nadia Abu-Zahra, who teaches in our School of Development Studies and Development and Global Studies. And Nadia has also published a book called Unfree in Palestine, which looks at the way administrative controls operate in the occupied territories to denationalize and render people stateless and in fact expel them from those territories. So the way we're going to do this is Miko Peled will speak first, and then Professor Abu-Zahra will respond and talk about similar issues, but perhaps from a slightly different perspective. So welcome to both of you. Please join me in welcoming them.
Okay, thank you, and thanks for the introduction. And thank you all for being here this afternoon. I apologize for the yellow color. Something went wrong here, so we're not sure what. So a couple of things, just before I start my talk. How many people here actually are from, anybody here from the area, from Israel, Palestine? Okay. Anybody have family there still? How many people visited, have been there? Okay. Is there anybody who can't find it on the map?
You're in Canada, not San Diego.
You'd be surprised the responses I get. But I guess we're in good company here. So that's good. I like to ask that just to kind of get an idea of who's in the audience and how much detail to get into. Now, I like to preface my remarks by warning everybody that my take on this issue is not balanced, and my presentation is not balanced. And so if anybody came here hoping to hear kind of a balanced presentation, that's not the case. I don't think there is a balanced presentation on this issue. And I think if anybody claims that their presentation is balanced, then they're either not being honest to themselves or not being honest to their audience. Because if you're up here talking about it, you probably have a very strong point of view, one way or the other. And I certainly do. And for me, it's also a very personal issue. With my family background, I have a grandfather who signed the Israeli Declaration of Independence. My father was a general. I served in the Israeli army. You know, the state of Israel was kind of like my extended family. So that's the background. That's where I come from. Now, this issue is, I think, part of the problem with this issue, or one of the reasons people seem to think it's such a complicated issue, is because there's so much, it's covered with so many layers of myth, and there's so much double standard, and whereas normally you might, when you're discussing an issue, you pretty much agree on the facts, but then you might disagree on the interpretation, or you might disagree on how to move forward. But in this particular issue, the disagreement is on the actual history, it's on the actual facts, and that makes it a lot more complicated. One such myth, or one such, myth I suppose, about this issue is that those people over there have been killing each other for so long, that this conflict's been going on for so long, that there's really no hope for a solution. And that's not true. I think we can pretty much find the point when this conflict began and start tracking it from there. And it's a political issue. It's not that those people over there are somehow predisposed to killing each other. And then in terms of the double standard, it's very interesting. The whole idea through which the State of Israel was established, the ideology, if you will, is Zionism. And what Zionism says is that Jewish people today Jewish people all around the world, because they are perhaps the descendants of the ancient Hebrews who lived on that land some 2,000 or 3,000 years ago, they have a right, and the term that is used is to return. They have a right to go back to their ancient historic homeland. On the face of it, it seems like an absurd proposition. I mean, you have to wonder how anybody accepted it. But there we are, and today people accept this notion that Jews have a right to return, that they somehow have some kind of a birthright, or a God-given right, or historical right to go. And the term that's be used is always to return, even though there's not a single Jewish person alive today that can trace their family roots back to 2,000 or 3,000 years ago to the ancient Hebrews. But there we have it. This is accepted. This has become accepted. On the other hand, if we talk of the right of return of Palestinians, this is an entirely different issue. And most people, or I should say most people who are aligned with the state of Israel and with a Zionist point of view, if you bring up the issue of the right of return of the Palestinians, then that's a red line that nobody's willing to cross. The right of return has to be taken off the table. This was a long time ago, and the Palestinians have to forget. So people who claim a right from 2,000 or 3,000 years ago are telling a people whose family members were displaced only 65 years ago that their claim is too old and therefore they need to forget. And once again, this is the type of discourse that exists today, and this is perfectly accepted everywhere we go. Now, people who were displaced 65 years ago, many of them are still alive. Many of them still have the keys to their home. Many of the homes are still there. Yet we have this double standard, where it's acceptable for the Jews to return, even though none of us have ever been there, historically, or none of our ancestors that we can trace back have ever been there, and the Palestinians who have the proof and the deeds and the keys and are still alive are not permitted to return. And again, this is part of the problem. This is part of the of why this is such a complicated issue, is because these are very, very basic ideas upon which people don't agree. Can you hit that thing? The thing? So, in going back to this idea that this is an intractable conflict that's been going on forever, I think an actual time that we can start discussing this issue, a good time to start discussing this issue, is precisely November of 1947, November 29th, 1947, when the United Nations passed a resolution to partition Palestine. And again, I apologize for the strange color. But if you look at the map within Palestine, within the boundaries of Palestine, and you had nothing, if you know nothing about the issue, but you see how this map this partition was put together, it seems like an absurd idea. I mean, how do you go on the ground and actually mark the boundaries of this thing? So that's tough enough. But beyond that, what the United Nations did that was strange, is they opted to give the larger portion of the land to the small community of Jewish immigrants who had been living in Palestine at the time. There were less than 500,000 Jews living there at the time. Most of them were immigrants or the children of immigrants that had immigrated over the few decades leading up to that point. But the United Nations decided that they will give them the larger portion of the land, and the Palestinians, who are the natives of the land, who numbered close to 1.5 million people, would get the smaller portion of the land. And you have to wonder, why did anybody think this would work? I mean, who in the right mind would accept something like this? And what's interesting is, to this day, we hear people talk about this issue, and Palestinians are blamed for not having accepted the partition resolution. They're being blamed for this conflict going on for 65 years because the Palestinians did not agree to the partition resolution, and we, the Israelis, did. Why would they agree? That the United Nations would come, chop off the larger portion of their own country, their own land, and give it to a small group of immigrants, a small community of immigrants. And I don't think anybody expected it to work, and it certainly didn't work. And this map didn't last a single day, because as soon as this resolution was accepted, what we Israelis call the war of, the War of Independence, or the War of 1948, began. And again, here's the two sides diverge, and you have two completely different narratives. The story that I learned as a child, as an Israeli, And the story that people learn here in Canada, I'm sure, and all over the West, in the Western world, is that the Arabs attacked. Immediately after this resolution was accepted by the United Nations, the Arabs refused it, did not recognize it, and they attacked with the intention of destroying the small Jewish community that had just been given recognition as a state. And this war went on for 12 months. At the end of that war, the State of Israel was established. The Israeli forces, which later on became the Israeli army, conquered the land, and the Jews prevailed. And this makes perfect sense because we are the descendants of King David who beat Goliath. And we are the descendants of the Maccabees who defeated great empires and so on. So that myth, that strain of mythology continues and makes perfect sense. And we'll see, we'll talk about later how it continues to this day. Now, if we look at the two communities that existed there at the time, like I said, we had a small community of Jewish immigrants and the children of immigrants, who were my grandparents and my parents. And then we had the Palestinian community, and both communities were expecting and hoping to be recognized as a state. And they had institutions of state. But there was one thing that the Jewish community, the Zionist community, had that the Palestinians didn't. And that's a fighting force. It's a militia. At that time, the Zionist militia numbered close to 40,000 well-armed, well-trained men. And more importantly, very well indoctrinated. My father was an officer in that militia. There was no equivalent on the Palestinian side. There was no fighting force. There was no militia. And so when we hear that the Arabs attacked, we have to wonder which Arabs attacked. What did they attack with? Now, we know that other Arab countries intervened, but that wasn't until much later on. That was until May, June of 1948. That was 6-7 months later. And the reality is, of course, that the Arabs did not attack. But as soon as this resolution was accepted, the Zionist forces, the Jewish forces, began a massive campaign that lasted 12 months of terrorizing and ethnic cleansing, with the intention of capturing as much land as possible, much more than was given to them in this resolution, and ridding the country of as much of its native population as possible. Within 12 months, they conquered almost 80% of the country. They managed to displace almost 1 million people, and they destroyed hundreds and hundreds of towns and cities and villages, including churches and mosques and schools and homes, of course, and began a building project for Israeli Jews only on that land. Now the story makes sense. Now we understand how this was accomplished. And later on, when the Arab armies did try to intervene, they were no match for the Israeli forces, for the Israeli militia at all. And so they were very easily defeated. Can you hit the next one, please? Now, the Palestinians call it the Nakba, or the catastrophe. We, the Israelis, call it independence. And much of our identity as Israelis, and many Jewish people who prescribe to the Zionist idea, see that victory of 1948 as a big part of our identity, because we were once again the descendants of King David fighting Goliath. We were the small, the few, the weak, and we defeated these great Arab armies. So it's a good myth to believe in. It's very easy to believe in it, but when we realize that it's not true, then there's an identity problem. And this was my own experience. I was offended when I heard that Palestinians called the war of 1948 a catastrophe. I was personally offended. How can they call such a great, momentous occasion or event a catastrophe? But this is why. This refugee camp is called the Gaza refugee camp. It's in Jordan, northern Jordan. The fact that Palestinians have to live under these conditions today, 65 years after the war of 1948, and this is what, an hour and a half drive from Jerusalem, from Tel Aviv, from Haifa, with no sewage, no running water, in poverty that is absolutely shocking, is exactly why it's a Nakba. It's exactly what the catastrophe is. It wasn't just something that happened 65 years ago, but it's the ongoing reality that Palestinians, with which Palestinians have to live to this day. And that's precisely why it's called a Nakba, and that's precisely why it is a catastrophe. Go ahead, next one. This is Gaza itself. This is the result of Israeli attacks, air raids. When Israel drops hundreds of tons of bombs on Gaza, this is the result. So children going to school, passing homes like this, don't know if they will have a home when they come back from school. They don't know if their friends, their family members, and so on will be killed in a raid like this the next day, the next hour, the next week. This is the reality under which Palestinians have to live every single day, and to this day, 65 years after the war of 1948, and this is precisely what the catastrophe means. This is precisely why it is a Nakba, why it is a catastrophe. It's inexcusable, it's unjustifiable. And I don't think anybody can explain it. Okay, go ahead, please. The reality is, going back onto the map in the history, between 1948 and for 20 years until 1967, this was the map of Israel. So everything, like I said, almost the entire country, with the exception of the Gaza Strip and the West Bank, were included in the state of Israel. And within those 20 years, Israel established itself, built, like I said, towns and villages and farms and so on for Israeli Jews only on this land which used to belong to Palestinians. Then in the spring and early summer of 1967, the drums of war began beating once again. And and they began beating, some of you I'm sure know this, the Egyptian President Nasser decided to enter his troops into the Sinai Peninsula, violating the ceasefire agreement between Israel and Egypt, and the Israeli military saw this as a cause for war, a legitimate cause for war. The Israeli cabinet was not quite sure. They were hoping to somehow resolve this diplomatically, but the military high command was insistent that it is time for war. My father was a general, and he was part of the Israeli top command by then. And in several meetings between the generals and the cabinet and among the generals themselves, he was among the very vocal group of generals who pushed and insisted that it was time for war. Now, the story that we hear, I think I have an extra picture of him. That's my father. That's the general. The book is titled A General's Son. This is the general. But if you could go back to the map for a second. Thanks. Now, the story that we hear about this war of 1967 is very similar to what we heard about 1948. Once again, the Arabs were intending to attack in order to destroy the state of Israel. Once again, the state of Israel was under an existential threat. And miraculously, because the army was prepared and the Israelis had held the moral high ground and they're more sophisticated and so on, they engaged in a preemptive strike, and they managed to defeat the Arab armies and conquer the Sinai Peninsula, the West Bank, the Gaza Strip, and the Golan Heights up in the north from the Syrians. And this is the story that's out there. And it's quite miraculous to think that really a small state like Israel was able within 6 days to defeat 3 Arab armies, triple the size of the state, and accomplish so much in 6 days while it was being attacked from the outside. Could you hit the next one? Go back to the picture. So, yeah, that's good. Now, in preparation for the book, one of the things I did was I went into the Israeli Army archives to learn about my father's career, about his military career. And one of the things that's available in the Israeli Army archives are the actual minutes of the meetings of the generals leading up to the war, and the meetings between the general, the high command, and the Israeli cabinet at the time. And these were it's very interesting because these were very, I don't know what they were, almost explosive, these meetings. The generals were really pushing for war, and there was this really intense tug of war between these two power groups. But of course, the generals won the day. But in their discussions, in the minutes of the meetings, the first thing that I noticed, which I hadn't read or seen anywhere else, even though a lot has been written about those meetings and about that period, is the generals themselves, my father and the others, saying that the Egyptian army is not prepared for war. The Egyptians are advancing an army that is ill-prepared. And therefore, we now have an opportunity to once again destroy the Egyptian army. That the Egyptian army is going to need at least 1.5 to 2 years before it's prepared for war. Therefore, Israel must attack now because we have an opportunity. Not a single word about a threat. In fact, they were saying the fact that the Egyptian forces were coming closer to the border with Israel only made it easier for the Israeli military to destroy them. And they say we can attack now, we can attack later, but let's attack now. So what happened to the threat? What happened? Where's the existential threat? Not a single word about a threat, only about an opportunity. And then they perpetuated this notion of a threat in order to apply pressure on the government to start the war, and then later on to excuse the war itself. In 6 days, the war was over in 6 days. The war against the battle against they destroyed the Egyptian army within the first couple of days, and then the generals on their own wanted to take the West Bank, which was an area that Israel had wanted for a very long time. They felt it was finishing the job because it was a part of the land of Israel that wasn't taken yet. And then they wanted the Golan Heights because it had water resources and so forth. And within 6 days, they managed to do all that. They destroyed 3 Arab armies. They killed upwards of 15,000 soldiers at a loss of 700 soldiers to the Israeli forces. And of course, every soldier that dies breaks your heart. He's somebody's son. At the same time, the difference between 15,000 and 700 is telling. And they captured, like I said, they tripled the size of the state of Israel. Go ahead, hit the next slide. And in fact, what occurred that was relevant to the Israeli-Palestinian issue is this: Palestine was completely erased off the map, and Israel took its place over the entire country, which exactly is what the intention was. Now, as the war was coming to a close on the 5th or 6th day of the war, at the very first meeting of the Israeli High Command, my father stood up and said, well, now we conquered all this land, we still have to solve the Palestinian problem, and now we have an opportunity to allow the Palestinians to create their own state within the West Bank and Gaza. And as he was saying these, and this is where he diverged and really pulled away from the Israeli establishment, because as he was saying these words, immediately as the war was over, Israel began a massive campaign of destroying cities and towns and homes, expelling hundreds of thousands of Palestinians, and building for Israeli Jews only in the West Bank, which is exactly what they did after the War of 48 in the rest of the country. The intention was to integrate the West Bank completely into the rest of the country, and that's exactly what they were doing, and that's exactly what they did. So today when people come back and they say, well, Israel actually wants to make peace with the Palestinians based on a two-state solution, based on allowing them a state in the West Bank, there is no evidence at all that shows that. Nothing Israel has ever done allows us to believe that. In fact, everything Israel has ever done proves the opposite, because they did everything they possibly could between the end of the war of 1967 and today to integrate the West Bank, and they did. Today it's fully integrated into Israel. There is no difference between the two, between those two parts. It's all one country, it's all one state. Now the mission, if you will, first of all was to conquer the land. That was accomplished. The second part was the ethnic cleansing. It's still going on. It didn't end. But there was a major campaign of ethnic cleansing in 48, and there was another major campaign right after the War of 67. And it's still going on, it's not over. But then we have another problem, because Palestine was an Arab country for 1,500 years. So you have Arab monuments, and you have Arab names, and you have an entire Arab culture that's part of that land. So it has to be de-Arabized. So names are being changed, monuments are being destroyed, and the entire culture of the country is being changed to reflect this mythology that Israel wants to perpetuate, that today's Israel is somehow the descendant of the ancient kingdom of the Hebrews, of King David and Solomon and so forth. Probably the most striking example, there are plenty of examples of this happening every single day, even today, but probably the most striking example is in a community called Silwan, which is just outside the walls of the old city. It's a community of 50,000 people, and somebody said that the ancient city of King David, the real city of King David, lies under the ground, under the homes of Silwan, a community of 50,000 people. So the homes are being destroyed, and an archaeological park is being built. And you can already see the tour buses of tourists coming to see the city of David. Now there's no historical proof that there was a King David. But a community of 50,000 people is being destroyed. Their homes are being destroyed. They're forced to leave. The homes in the periphery are falling apart because the foundations are being destroyed from the digging, and Israeli settlers are taking over the homes in the larger area. So the process of ethnic cleansing, destruction, and de-Arabizing, all taking place in one place, in one locale, and it's in broad daylight every single day. And this is right outside Jerusalem. Go ahead. I think one of the issues that needs to be addressed and is not addressed often enough, I think, is the issue of the Palestinian resistance and basically the price that is being paid so that there is a Jewish state in Palestine. One of the claims my father made way back then in that famous meeting at the end of the Six-Day War, of 1967 war, was that if Israel did not allow the Palestinians to establish their own state and recognize their right to self-determination, that Israel will become an occupying power. The Palestinians will resist. The Israeli army will become an occupation army. And then the results of that are obviously that they're going to have thousands of political prisoners, which is what Israel has today and has for many, many years. Thousands and thousands of Palestinian political prisoners. There's a resistance that has to be quelled and has to be fought all the time on a regular basis. Now, what's interesting about the prisoner issue is that over 90% of the prisoners in Israeli, or the Palestinian prisoners, are political prisoners. Even though Israel calls them security prisoners, they call them terrorists, the vast majority have never been charged with any acts of violence. The vast majority have not been charged with acts of violence. This particular picture is a vigil in Bethlehem of the parents of prisoners. And if we look at international law, and this is from United Nations resolutions, I put it up there, it says clearly the struggle of peoples under colonial and alien domination and racist regimes, which really is what Israel is. This really describes what the state of Israel, because it is a colonial and alien domination and it is a racist regime. For the implementation of their rights of self-determination and independence is completely legitimate and in full accordance with international law. Now, I served in the Israeli army, an army that's dedicated to keeping Palestinians away from their land, that's allowing Israelis to build on that land, and that's killing and arresting and torturing Palestinians who dare to resist. Palestinians, however, in prisons, thousands and thousands of them, some of them dying now from on hunger strikes, are called the terrorists. Which of us is really the terrorist here? I think is a question that needs to be asked. And which of us is actually conducting a legitimate resistance? But this is the price that has to be paid when you have a Jewish state in an Arab country where half the population is not Jewish. It's exactly the brutality of the military, it's the political prisoners, and it's the racist laws which Israel has as well. Go ahead to the next one. Now, like I said earlier, Israel completely integrated the West Bank into the rest of the country, which is what they intended to do and what they said they intended to do all along. Today, when you talk to Israeli politicians, you talk to Israeli military commanders, whether they be lieutenants at a checkpoint or generals, they'll tell you the exact same thing. There is no difference between the cities in the West Bank and the cities in other parts of the country. This is Israel and this is Israel. And that's how they justify what they call, securing or defending Israelis everywhere. Israel created a state that is a Jewish state on all of Palestine. Now, what I did in my book, the way I completed the book, and the last things I'll talk about today, is where do we go from here? Since Israel created this reality where it is one state, but it's a racist state inevitably, because only half the population is Jewish. You have about 6.5 million Israelis who are Jewish, and you have about 6 million Palestinians. The only way to have a Jewish state when half the population is not Jewish is through racist laws, which Israel has, laws that discriminate against the Palestinians, a brutal army, and a bureaucracy that makes life absolutely impossible to live for Palestinians. So, people still talk about this idea that Israel will one day allow the Palestinians a state of their own. Where exactly? How exactly? Which Israeli government is going to do this? Based on what? The whole idea of the creation of the State of Israel was to reclaim the land of Israel, which is Palestine, and give it to the Jewish people. There has never been a single Israeli government that was willing to give up any part of that land. The most any Israeli government was ever willing to do was allow the Palestinians limited autonomy on limited areas. They were all determined by the State of Israel, and including Israel's famous 3 no's. No to negotiating the Jordan River Valley, no to negotiating on the expanded boundaries of East Jerusalem, and no to negotiating on the major settlement blocks. These three no's mean no to a Palestinian state, because these three make up most of the West Bank. And this is the most progressive, if you will, Israeli government that ever was. So the question still remains, where do we go from here? And I would argue that the most natural thing to do is to allow equal rights and move forward. Allow the Palestinians and create a state where Israelis and Palestinians are all citizens of the state. All have equal rights. This means that it won't be a Jewish state. Excuse me. This means that it won't be a Jewish state. And like I said, if we take a look at the two options, the Jewish state as it is today, probably for as long as they can hold on, or the transformation into a real democracy, certainly for Israelis and Palestinians, the second choice is better, moving forward. Some people believe that there's value in having a Jewish state and paying that price. I would argue that that is a racist idea. But those are the two options. A third option where we somehow partition the land does not exist. And like I explained that earlier. Now, one last thing, I'm very hopeful. I think this is a very realistic approach. I think this is a very doable solution. I think it's an inevitable solution. Besides being more just and morally the right thing to do, I think it's also the most realistic thing to do, and I think it's inevitable. Israeli and Palestinian societies are very similar. Merging the two would be very easy into one state. I would argue that if the wall came down tomorrow and this was one state, you would have a functioning democracy the next day. Certainly with its problems, as every state does. But multi-nation states are not a new thing. I don't have to tell you this here in Canada. Multi-nation states where two nations maintain their identity but live together in one state is not a new thing. And so I would encourage people who care about the region, who care about justice, who care about peace, to put their efforts into this. Just like efforts were put into ending apartheid in South Africa, or racist and brutal regimes anywhere else in the world, I think everybody's efforts need to be put into ending this regime and allowing for real democracy to emerge in Palestine. Thank you all very much. Just disconnect yours.
Okay, well, I'd like to thank Miko. Miko and I met earlier today, and he asked me, are we going to be pitted against one another, Israeli versus Palestinian, like, Mickey Mouse with swords, back and forth. And he's a sixth Dan, which you'll read at the back of his book. So I'm not going to be pitted against a karate master in front of an audience. So the answer, of course, is no, and largely because of what you said. Largely because, as you said, if the wall were to come down, it'd be quite easy, really. Quite easy in future. And the wall is just a physical aspect. The wall is just, it's concrete, it's 8 to 11 meters high, and it certainly is a barrier, and it certainly is a wall. But before that was a bureaucracy. And I think the importance of what Miko is saying about the future is that he's talking about things that go beyond the old cliches of land and force. And so we heard a lot just now about force, about military, about wars, about momentous 6 days that transform the following, several decades. But at the same time, we heard about land. We saw maps of land. And these are the things that we hear a lot when we talk about the past. When we talk about the past, we talk about land. We talk about force. But what's interesting is Miko's vision of the future, because it's not just about land and force and about remembering land and force over the past. It's about a future that focuses more on population, on people. And instead of seeing categories of people, branded this or branded that, he's talking about equality, about all people having equal opportunity. And that's the way to look at the future. And in a way, it would help us if we even looked at the past as well through that lens of population, and not only about land, and of bureaucracy and not only about force. And these maps, for those new to the subject, describe what Miko describes in the beginning in the pre-1948, the situation of Palestinians on the left, living in various communities, multi-faith communities. The situation on the right is the transformation of that, the demolition of villages and displacement of people. But if we move to the next slide, we see that there was a Palestinian nationality. There were identity cards, there were passports, it was recognized internationally. And again, multi-faith. If you want to move on to the next slide. And overnight, 1.4 million Palestinians were denationalized, so they were no longer considered by the world community as Palestinian, overnight. And a new set of identity documents began to be distributed on the basis of a population registry. And so things were noted down, such as, physical measurements and so on. And a population registry was established, and an identity number was given to every individual. And on that basis, that's when it all began. 1948 was not just a war of land, of armies, of shifting borders and boundaries. It was the establishment of a system that only decades later would we start to publicly say, this is racist, this is discriminatory, this is a system of dividing people on the basis of people, right? And so this is a prisoner, a Palestinian prisoner being measured and his, physical details taken down. And the population registry was not only of prisoners, it was of all people within the area at the time. And the purpose, unlike population registries in other parts of the world, was not to figure out who to keep, but rather who to keep out. These are very modern permits. These were issued at the time that the wall went up. And so they're signed by various military officers. They note your vehicle number and so on and so forth. And they tell you whether you have permission, where to go, and what you can do, and so on. Next one. Now, these identity documents become so important decades later. So here we are, 2013. These identity documents are very, very important, that you can't live without one. Many Palestinians will say, oh, you can't live without one. And of course, they're a means of coercion, right? They're the carrot and the stick. So this is an actual discussion that took place between a secret service agent, Israeli secret service agent in 1994, and a Palestinian. Next. This is my second last slide, and this is where I think Miko really holds something for us in his book and in his hope for the future. Because when he says that it is one racist state, he's not joking. And if you look at the map on the right, these are highways. And there is actually an outline of the West Bank. I made this map at my PhDs in geography, and I did, in fact, include a line around the West Bank, but it's invisible because it's completely crowded out by the road system. And in fact, if you have a certain identity document, if you have a certain numbering of your, number in the population registry, you can go on all of these roads on the right, and you can zip north-south and zip east-west, and that border, that boundary, that armistice line, which is what it actually is, a 1949 armistice line between, the West Bank is between Jordan and Israel, that doesn't exist for you if you have a certain document. And this is the crux of the issue, is that you can distinguish not on the basis of borders and land and so on. You distinguish based on who you are and how you're listed in the population registry. And recognizing that system today, recognizing that inequality, helps to understand that what is required for change is not just a negotiation over this bit of land or that bit of land. It's about bringing about equality among individuals such that you don't need a certain colored document in order to go on certain roads. And so the map on the left is where Palestinians are confined, the black areas, and the white are the roads that they are allowed to use. And the punctuations, the circles on the white, are tunnel checkpoints. So basically that's where you can be blocked off at any given moment. And the gray areas, 4 little appendages on the northwest side of the West Bank, and the gray areas at the top and the gray areas down at the bottom, which is continued in a triangle, are where most Palestinians who have Israeli citizenship live. What many people don't know is that from 1948 to 1966, a period of 18 years just before the 1967 war, were confined to those areas. So it's not a coincidence that that is where they live, plus segregated areas within cities. When I say segregated, I also mean that there are walls that actually exist within cities, within what is now known as the State of Israel, literally walls that exist between communities. And so for 18 years they were confined. At the time of the 1967 war, that so-called military government ended. But as you can see, they remain where they were confined for 18 years. And through this system of checkpoints and identity documents that we now know very well in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. So it was a system that began in 1948 and that continues essentially till the present, just in different areas. And that, I think, when Miko talks about equality, about changing a system, changing a bureaucracy, when we look forward, suddenly we understand it's not just about land or about force. It's not just about an absence of violence in the physical violent sense, not the structural violent sense. It's about more than that. It's about changing the structures of inequality, and that is absolutely where Miko hits the nail on the head. So very last slide. This is a quote from an Israeli journalist, Amira Haas, who writes in Haaretz. And the poster is a little bit of a spoof. The one on the left is a poster that was done in the 1920s, and the one on the right was clearly some point recently. Right? So that's all I have to say and to add. Thank you.